Okay then, I think we all know that the story of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, very much revolves around the story of ancient Israel and their deliverance from the land of Egypt. They'd been slaves in Egypt for a number of decades. Life was quite hard for them. Along comes Moses, and God intervenes with lots of plagues, ending up, of course, with the death of the firstborn and God passing over the homes of the Israelites. All right? And then, of course, Israel gathers together and leaves Egypt, making their way towards their kingdom, the promised land. And so this time of year, we spend quite a bit of time looking at those stories, going over them as we try to understand better the Passover itself and what unleavened bread teaches us. And of course, only last week, a few days ago, we kept the night to be much remembered, which that particular night, that night time, as the first holy day starts, we'll think back and we remember the night to be much observed, much remembered, ancient Israel heading off. Now, when they left Egypt, they went out joyfully with a high hand, it says, because after all, if you've been a slave people under Pharaoh and his harsh taskmasters, and here's your chance to leave that life behind you and head off to what you've been told is a promised land of abundance and prosperity and great harvests and vineyards and orchards and, of course, freedom, that's pretty good. So you set off joyfully, excited. But of course, you have to realize that the journey from Egypt to the promised land is going to be a journey which will entail some obstacles, some perils. There will be risks en route, right? And, God had done all the hard work up till then. It was God who sent the plagues, the frogs, the flies, the locusts, the darkness. But at this point now, Israel themselves are going to have to start, walking quite a long way, and they're going to meet obstacles, difficulties, trials en route. It's not going to be easy peasy getting to the promised land. And I think people understand that that's sort of a picture of your life and my life. At some point in time, we're called out of our old way of living. We accept our Passover, Jesus Christ, and we set off on our journey towards God's kingdom, the eternal promised land. And we should realize, I think we probably do fairly quickly, that there are going to be obstacles, perils, trials, difficulties and tests en route. So in that sense, the example of ancient Israel is quite a good picture of the life, the Christian life, Christian living, right? And as ancient Israel went through the wilderness on their journey, there are many lessons there that are of benefit or should be of benefit to you and to me. Let's open our Bibles at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, see what that tells us. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and we'll read the first 13 verses. And if you've heard me before, you've heard this before, because this covers what I class as essential teaching for this time of year. I look for, food in due season. And at this season of the year, Passover, the Exodus, escaping from Egyptian slavery, heading to the promised land under God's direction and Moses, the man of God. To me, this is a good time of year to review these lessons. So that's what we're going to be doing. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, the Red Sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So all of them, there might have been around 2 million or more. All of them leave Egypt. All of them head off to the promised land. But, verse 5, but with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Oops. As it turns out, of the adult population, only 2 actually entered the promised land. That's not many out of perhaps 1.5 million adults, 2. And clearly Paul's suggesting this might be an important lesson or a warning to people like you and me, the people of Corinth of that day, you and me today. Verse 6, now these things became our examples. That's why we're reading them again today, as we did last year and probably the year before, I suspect, because they're examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And then Paul gives a number of major problems that they hit en route. Verse 7, do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, a euphemism for sexual immorality. We'll come to that later. Verse 8, nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ. Remember, the rock that followed them was Christ. Jesus was there with them, but they tempted, tried, tested, provoked Jesus. Verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain,
we wouldn't do that,
as some of them also complained, or I think murmur is a good alternative. They murmured. They complained, and I don't know about you, I don't suppose too many of you are going to commit sexual immorality, right, or idolatry directly, but murmuring, complaining. There's a good chance that you will be a murmurer and a complainer at least some of the time, and probably me as well, right? So some of them, verse 10, nor complain as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. It's obvious God doesn't like complaints. Not about him anyway, right? You complain about your wife, your husband, your kids, your dog, whatever, the tax man, but you better not complain and murmur about God. That's not a good idea. Verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So these things that happened to ancient Israel on the journey through the wilderness to the promised land have been written down for you and for me to learn from. They're examples. I mean, examples of what not to do, essentially, right? Verse 12, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So if you think you're sorted, right, you can't fall because you've been around the church 6 months, 6 years, 60 years. Well, okay, maybe you won't fall. You shouldn't fall, but don't be complacent. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. Sometimes we think we're unique. You know, nobody's ever had the troubles I've had. Nobody's seen the troubles I've seen. Yes, they have. Right? Nothing's unique in that sense. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted, tested, or tried beyond what you are able, but with the temptation, test, or trial, the Greek includes, will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. So what the scripture tells us is nothing should be able to knock you down and keep you down. You might be like the weeble, you get knocked over, but you bounce back up again. You get knocked down, but you bounce back up again. That's what happens to weebles.
they wobble and
They wobble, but they don't fall down. And that says there that God is faithful. He will lift us up. He will make the way of escape so that we can survive every test, trial, tribulation, obstacle, peril, right? But these things, it says here clearly, were written down for our learning. So let's learn from them. And what it looks like is that in the journey to when it all went totally wrong and Israel ran out of runway, so to speak, 10 times they provoked God. Not once, not twice, not 8, but 10 times. Now God is patient and God is faithful. God, thank heavens, is patient. He's put up with you and me for a long time, right? You wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. If we were in charge, we'd have wiped each other out a long time ago. But God is very patient. But even so, there is a line, and you don't want to go for that line. Wherever that line is, wherever God's drawn that line, you and I want to make sure we're on the right side of that line. Ancient Israel went past that line, and we just read only 2 of the 1.5 million adults got into the promised land. The rest didn't survive. So 10 times it seems they provoked God. We'll see that a bit later. So we're going to look at these 10 occasions, these 10 times they provoked God, and learn what lessons we can learn, from the Exodus adventures of ancient Israel. So let's start back in Exodus 14. Exodus chapter 14 will be in Exodus and Numbers for much of the time. Exodus 14, let's read verses 5 through 12. So Israel's gathered together on the night to be much remembered and are heading off, joyfully. Verse 5, Exodus 14. Now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people, and they said, "Why have we done this? That we've let Israel go from serving us?" You would have thought, well, pretty obvious, The land of Egypt is in complete ruins. The firstborn are all dead. Why have we done it? Well, because we're scared of what would happen with the next plague. But obviously he wasn't thinking rationally. Verse 6, so he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. Also, he took 600 choice chariots and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with boldness because they were free, right? So the Egyptians pursued them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen, his cavalry, and his army. It wasn't just a few chariots, the entire army goes as well, and overtook them, camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. And I think Josephus, the Jewish historian, says there were 600 choice chariots, there were 50,000 horsemen, and there were 200,000 foot soldiers. Well, that's 250,000 military men, right? After you, that's quite a lot, okay? That's enough to sort of do for you, right? Verse 10, and when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, Amen, hallelujah, let's see the salvation of Jehovah God.
Did they say that?
No, they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? It would be better for us to serve the Egyptians as slaves rather than that we should die in the wilderness. So they are fearful, right? They are about to die, and they're complaining and murmuring already. It's only hours after they've left, right, the land, or a day or two anyway, okay, and already they're doomed. We're doomed. We're doomed. We're all going to die out here. Moses, it's your fault. You should have left us alone as slaves. We were happy as slaves. What's the idea? Taking us out here to kill us all in the wilderness, all of our wives and children. Oh, dear, dear, dear. We're doomed. So where's their faith? Well, there's no faith, is there? Not in God. At this stage of the game, they're walking by sight. Actually, the whole journey, they walk by sight. And faith is really very, very rare, right? And of course, the lesson in a sense here is when you and I leave our past, our spiritual Egypt, very often it comes after us. I mean, that might be many years since you came through conversion and baptism, right? But if you look back, it's not uncommon for people who are trying to leave their bad past behind them to discover it comes after them, right? Just like Pharaoh, Satan came after Israel, right? Let's read verses 13 through 16 because there obviously is a solution. And Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." So, Moses understands God's going to take care of this. But just settle down. Calm your souls. This is in God's hands. And the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. But lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh, and over all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." All right? Drop down to verses 21 to 31. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued, not so wise, I don't think. The Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch, just before dawn, in other words, that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. And he took off their chariot wheels. 2 wheels on my wagon, but I'm still rolling along. The Cherokees are after me. And he took off their chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." Of course, a bit late at this stage. If the wheels are off your wagon, you're not going anywhere in a hurry. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. That's over 250,000 military men and horses. Not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand, on their left. Verse 30, so the Lord saved or delivered Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt, so the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So that's quite an amazing miracle. I guess nothing like it since those days. But there's Israel, former slaves, and now they're looking at across the beach and at the water, and all you've got is dead soldiers, dead horses floating there, hundreds of thousands of them, and they saw it. And of course, when they see it, well, they're always going to be walking by sight, of course, not by faith, but they see it, and they're convinced God has delivered us, he's secured us, he's saved us. Isn't that wonderful? Now, we've got a couple of slides to show you at this point. There are debates, of course. Anything in the Bible is subject to debates. One of the debates is where Mount Sinai is and where exactly ancient Israel crossed over the Red Sea. So I think the first one we've got here is a map looking down at the general area of Sinai. Top left, you've got Goshen and Ramesses and Sukkot, where ancient Israel began their journey on the night to be much remembered. Then the traditional story is that they go straight down to the point at the south, which is where the traditional Mount Sinai is. I think that's wrong. A lot of people, and I'm one of them, believe that Israel goes east, much higher up, and comes to the Gulf of Aqaba. This is the blue bit on the right there, and they cross over the Gulf of Aqaba just there, and Mount Sinai you might be able to see there is on the right-hand side in Arabia, in modern Saudi Arabia. So that's more likely the route. Then the next picture we've got is the Gulf of Aqaba. This is probably, some people have studied it, they've dived into the waters there. They reckon there are all manner of things like chariot wheels at the bottom of the sea there. So you've got, was it 10.5 miles across from Nuweiba on the left, the western side, across to Saudi Arabia on the eastern side, the right-hand side. And it tells you there it's fairly gentle walk down to the depth and back up the far side. So it looks like that's the journey, about 10 miles across the sea there. But of course, naturally disputed. I've looked into it as much as one can do, and it's the story makes sense to me. Okay, so that was the first time that you could argue they were not believing God, being a bit provocative. Oh, Moses, why have you brought us out here to kill us in the wilderness? We'd rather have been slaves back in Egypt. Not the greatest of starts. But let's look at the second time they provoked God. Chapter 15. And let's read verses 22 to 26. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, that's where we were, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Well, okay, I know what you're like. You're a bit like me, you'll whinge quickly, right, when you get uncomfortable. And so did they. But it's not very long, really.
Glad you admitted it.
3 days, it's not like a month. It's only 72 hours, right? Now, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained, or I think King James says murmured, right? Complained, murmured, bellyached against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. All right? So the people are complaining after 3 days, murmuring against Moses. We've only got just a sentence or two here, but you can imagine there's probably a lot of whinging, a lot of grumbling, a lot of people looking at each other and, why are we here? It's no use coming into the desert when there's no water to drink. We're going to die. We're going to die. We're going to die, right? There he made a statute and an ordinance for them. And there God tested them and said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, so it's conditional, if, right, you may not, but if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, keep all his statutes, I'll put none of the diseases on you which I've brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. I am Jehovah Rapha in Hebrew, all right? I am God your healer. So God says, if you diligently obey, I'm going to heal you. None of the diseases that you've seen on the Egyptians, all their problems that they had, won't happen to you if, right? But of course, the interesting thing there is that, they're already starting to grumble just 3 days into the journey, which doesn't look very promising, does it? Let's look at provocation number 3, which is in Exodus 16. We'll read verses 1 through 3. And they journeyed from Elim, that's where they were just there, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, not quite at Sinai yet, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. So, night, to be much remembered, is the 15th day of the first month. This looks like a month later. 15th day of the second month, verse 2. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained or murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died I mean, it's not great, is it? I wish we were dead.
At the words of your mouth.
I mean, what does Moses make of that? These people wish they were dead. Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord, in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat, goulash, stew, McDonald's burgers. When we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Not good, is it? I mean, even a carnal person like you and me can realize that this is not a right attitude to have when God's hovering over you in a cloud of fire and pillar of fire, right? It's not a good way to behave. Because they're accusing, Moses, it's your fault. You brought us out here. Where's God in this? And of course, what they're concerned about is their bellies, right? They're belly aching. Their bellies are hungry. They were thirsty a minute ago, now they're hungry. And they don't like hardship. I mean, well, neither do I for that matter, right? But you got to realize on this journey to the promised land, there are trials and tests and tribulations, right? But they don't get that. They're a bit hungry now, and so they're whinging and murmuring and threatening Moses and Aaron, right? Now God, of course, has a solution. God always has a solution. God makes a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. He always did, and I guess he always does. Let's read verses 4 and 5. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law, my Torah, or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in. It shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So God's going to introduce something brand new, bread that comes down miraculously from heaven, which we know, of course, as manna. But God's going to also introduce a test just to see if they're paying any attention, because he's going to make sure that they get twice as much on the 6th day, Friday, right? Okay, so they're complaining about being hungry, and God says, it's sorted, no concern. Every day I'll bring some bread out of heaven for you, right? Which is, of course, quite good. And so they get the manna, right? But that's provocation 3, that was. Number 4 is related to that. So verses 16 through 20, Exodus 16, but picking up in verse 16 through 20. So Moses says, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it, this bread from heaven, according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person. According to the number of persons, let every man take for those who are in his tent. Then the children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some a bit less. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over. He who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. And Moses said, Let no one leave any of it till morning. Make sure you consume it all today. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses or God who gave Moses instructions, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them, and you can bet your boots God was angry as well. Because his instructions, God's miraculously going to give you bread from heaven, consume it all the same day, leave nothing till the next day. But some say, oh, well, but how can I know that God will produce some tomorrow? After all, you just never know what God's going to do. I'll consume a lot of it today, but I'm going to put some in a little box in the corner for tomorrow, just in case God doesn't turn up, right? So it's doubt, right? And of course it's disobedience at its simplest, right? And Moses is angry because he knows who he's dealing with. The people clearly don't. I think at times they think that he's dealing with Moses, human being who makes mistakes. But I mean, God was behind Moses, right? So that's another provocation there. Number 5, still related to this story, we get in verses 23 through 30. Then Moses said to them, This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. And this is before we've got to Mount Sinai, right? The Ten Commandments haven't been formalized yet. God hasn't written them down. He hasn't thundered out with his voice. But the Sabbath already exists. And God's going to make it very important, because this 6 days that you get your manna and it survives into the seventh day, that's going to continue for 40 more years. So endless miracles over 40 years to ram home the importance of the seventh day, right? So he continues, bake what you will bake today. So I guess it would be Friday when this conversation is taking place. Boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. New instruction. You don't do that, right? Sunday through Thursday, but on Friday you lay it up, what's left over. So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. Nice and fresh. Then Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none. That's clear enough. Now it happened, as it would of course, that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but found none. I don't know what happened there exactly. Did these people not put any leftovers from the previous day? Did they consume it all? Just think, we've got tomorrow, there'll be plenty. There is every day. What's the big deal? Is that what they did? Right? Or did they want more? But anyway, off they go on the seventh day to gather some, but they found none. Verse 28, and the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? He's provoked. Right? This is testing God's patience. God says, this is what you do, not this. And whatever God says, they just seem to do the opposite. See, verse 29, for the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the sixth day, Friday, bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place, on the Sabbath. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. And so the people rested on the seventh day. But you can see you've got just plain, simple disobedience there, right? It also does, I guess, just remind you and me in modern times about the importance that God attaches to his Sabbath day. Because for the next 40 years, the manna will come Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and it will be preserved into the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath day, there'll be no manna, no bread from heaven for 40 years, as God reminds them time and time and time again about his Sabbath, his holy Sabbath to the Lord, right? And you and I have to be a bit cautious that through familiarity, we don't treat the Sabbath, too casually, too lightly. Very easy when you kept the Sabbath. Well, your first time around, you're probably, very enthusiastic as a Sabbath keeper, or very weird, as I was. I think when I kept my first Sabbath, I'm still weird, somebody says. When I kept my first Sabbath, I only ate apples and drank water. Because I can't do any work in the Sabbath, so obviously you can't boil an egg, right? You can't do toast and marmalade, not in the Sabbath, because no work can be done. So my first Sabbath, I just had apples. I thought, I've got to eat something. So an apple doesn't require any preparation. You just chobble it. And then water, tap water, and job done. But over time, you realise that that's a little bit on the sort of a severe end of things, right? And you become a bit more relaxed about what you can do in the Sabbath. But you never forget, it's a holy Sabbath and it's God's Sabbath, so we have to be cautious. Okay, number 6, I guess it is Exodus 17. Exodus 17, I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. Then the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Not a problem. Been here before. We look to God, our deliverer, our provider, and God provides. That's what you might have thought might have happened. Therefore, verse 2, the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained, murmured, grumbled, bellyached against Moses and said, "Why is it you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So it's endless, isn't it? Really, it doesn't matter what you do, manna every morning. Here they are, a bit thirsty again, and straight away they're contending, arguing, protesting, and near to rioting against Moses. So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." A largely peaceful protest. But CNN might report it differently. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock." God's got legs and feet. Going to stand on this rock in Horeb, which is a range of mountains, one of which is Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, but I think it's quite an area in this part of Arabia. "I'll stand before you there on the rock in Horeb," the rock in Horeb. You almost think it's a specific rock that Moses may already have known about. It's the rock in Horeb. "And you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." Pools of water from flinty rocks, stony rocks. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah, which means temptation, and Meribah, which means contention or provocation, because they contended with Moses and provoked God. Because the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, if I was the Lord, I'd have vaporized them at that point. Because he's done all this, what he's done so far, right? And they say, "Well, I don't even know if God's among us or not. I haven't seen him. Have you seen him?" "I've not seen him, no." "Well, I don't think he's here." What, really? I mean, this is super provocative, really. It's a shocking comment to make, right? And, I suppose part of the lesson is that, God's ways aren't necessarily always easy or comfortable, right? There can be difficulties, as there were for ancient Israel going through the wilderness. There can be difficulties and obstacles, problems for you and for me. Some of our problems might be different to each other's. You might have had a particularly difficult time. Somebody else might have had a bit of an easier time. But all of us are going to go through problems and difficulties and tests and trials and obstacles, right? As ancient Israel did. And these things are written down for our learning, right? These people are super quick to grumble, super quick to protest, super quick to whinge, super quick to threaten violence. They don't get their way, right? Now, again, we've got a couple of, slides to show you. We've got there this rock in Horeb that Moses struck, out of which rivers and streams of water came. So I think the first photograph we've got, that there at the top sticking up is a rock that's been cleaved right down the middle. It's a huge rock. Down in the foreground of the picture, there's a small, it's a man, I think, a small figure there to give you an idea of the scale. So this is where those who've been across to Saudi Arabia, to the range of mountains around Horeb and Sinai, they reckon that rock appears to fit the descriptions, right? So that's potentially it. The next thing we've got is a bit of video, lasts I think about 40 or so seconds. It's taken by a drone, sort of flying over that area. So it flies up towards that rock, and there's some voiceover as well, somebody quoting from, I think, the book of Psalms and so on. So this will show you again what the area looks like.
"Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock. And there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. He clave the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink as out of the great depths. He brought streams also out of the rock, and caused waters to run down like rivers. I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ.
Okay. Can't prove it, of course, but people have been there, been around the area, checked it all out. There's a lot of artifacts there that look very supportive of the idea that's where ancient Israel ended up. Okay, let's move on to number 7 in terms of provoking God, which is Exodus chapter 32. Let's read verses 1 through 6 to start with. So Exodus 32, this is provocation number 7 of what appears to be 10 altogether. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, where Moses was up the top with God, the people gathered together to Aaron, or possibly the Hebrew allows gathered together against Aaron, and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. He's disappeared. We want a new God to go before us." And Aaron said to them, "Don't be ridiculous. Let us be faithful and loyal to Jehovah God." Aaron said, "Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons," the boys had earrings as well, "and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Or the Hebrew probably is a young bull type shape rather than a calf. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Really? So when Aaron saw it, the enthusiasm with which his young bull had been accepted, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation, said, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." Then they rose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, which is the quotation we saw earlier in 1 Corinthians. And rose up to play appears to be a euphemism. Most of the commentators will tell you that the Hebrew implies an orgy. Right? The Good News Bible, verse 6 says, "The people sat down to a feast which turned into an orgy of drinking and sex." This is at Mount Sinai. So Moses is up that mountain there, and Jehovah God's up that mountain there, and the people have got a young golden bull and are busy eating, drinking, and chasing each other around at the foot of the mountain. Is that provocative or what? Right, let's read verses 7 to 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Go get down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people.'" And, I've been provoked once too often. I'll put that in. "Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, that I may consume them. And I'll make of you a great nation." I mean, God was angry. It's not just putting words here. God's wrathful. These people are provocative right under his nose, right? He's communing with Moses about instructions for when they get to the promised land, how to live and prosper, and they're busy having an orgy. Well, God says, "That's it. I'll wipe them out. Start again with you, Moses." Then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, "Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt?" Don't blame me. "With great power and with a mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians speak and say, 'He brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath. relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham and Isaac and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So Moses reminds God of God's own promises to Abraham. You know, your friend Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Israel. You promised that. You better do it, you know, Jehovah God. Verse 14, so the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. Dropping down to verse 19 through 28. So Moses heads off down the mountain to find out, because unlike God, he can't see, he doesn't have angels reporting to him. So it was as soon as Moses came near the camp that he saw the calf and the dancing. I don't think it was a waltz to the Blue Danube. It was something a little bit more risque than that. So Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Then he took the calf which they had made, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the children of Israel drink it. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you, that you brought so great a sin upon them? You know, elsewhere in Deuteronomy it says that God wanted to destroy Aaron. So Moses had to go before God and say, no, you know, my big brother, please forgive him this once, etc., etc. But yeah, Aaron was within, you know, inches of being toast. Verse 22, so Aaron said, well, don't let the anger of my Lord become hot. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. And I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me. I cast it into the fire, and would you believe it? This calf came out. Nothing to do with me, Moses. I just threw in the gold, and you know what? It just transmuted, and out popped this young golden bull. Isn't that amazing, Moses? Well, Moses wasn't a fool. You can see the engraving marks all over the bull. Now, when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained, some translations say naked, or naked, I think some Americans pronounce it. When Moses saw the people were naked, or running wild, the net translation says, then Moses stood in the entrance of the camp and said, whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me. And all the sons of Levi in particular gathered themselves together to him. And he said to them, thus says Jehovah God of Israel, let every man put his sword on his side and go in and out from entrance to entrance throughout the camp. Let every man kill his brother, his companion, every man his neighbor. So the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. So there would be many more than 3,000 engaged in the orgy, of course, but one imagines these must be the ringleaders or the worst offenders, perhaps the ones that refuse to slow down and pay attention to Moses now he's turned up, right? So 3,000 die that day, right? And you can see the problem, underlying problem here, the people are impatient. You know, Moses had been gone for, I think, 40 days at this stage. What's happened to Moses? He'd been gone a long time. Oh, we can't hang about. We need to move on to the promised land. We need a new God to take us there, right? So you and I sometimes need a bit of patience. Things don't always happen quite at our pace, do they? Reminds me of Abraham when God said, "I'll give you children as many as the sand of the sea," and nothing happened, right? So Abraham and Sarah have a chat and decide that let's have Hagar and whatever. And she can produce perhaps a son and heir. So Ishmael comes along. It's not God's plan, but Abraham and Sarah were impatient. They could have waited longer, and then they get Isaac in due season. But they try and do it their way. Shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. Nor should I. We should wait patiently for God, right? And of course, you can see here how quick they were to turn to idolatry and try and worship God. I mean, they're not saying it was a different God. It was more a question of this bull represents Jehovah God somehow. but you can't do that, right? And you can see a disgraceful response from Aaron there. Caves in, the man of God, or a man of God of sorts, caves in under pressure from the people. Oops, right? So our eighth test, the eighth provocation of God takes place in the book of Numbers. So let's turn to Numbers chapter 10. Numbers 10, verse 33, and then Numbers 11, verses 1 through 3. There's no chapter break in the originals, so the story sort of continues over our chapter break. Verse 33, so they departed from the mountain of the Lord, the Mount Horeb, on a journey of 3 days. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them for the 3 days' journey to search out a resting place. Well, not too far, is it? 3 days' journey, right? But it seems they weren't very happy. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Now when the people complained, murmured, grumbled, bellyached, it displeased the Lord. For the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused, so the fire of the Lord burned among them, and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and when Moses prayed to the Lord, the fire was quenched. So he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord had burned among them. Now, there's no specific sort of reason given for the problem here, but just reading the language, verse 1, chapter 11. Now, when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. The commentators think it's because the people were just getting fatigued and fed up. The journey was taking longer than perhaps they'd ever anticipated. And 3 days journey, that's a long way to go, right? That's too long. I'm not ready for a 3 days journey. I want a 1 day journey at max, then stop off at McDonald's, have a McFlurry, whatever, right? Not going 3 day journey, it's inconvenient. My feet are sore, whatever it might be, right? So people complain. The other translations bring that out. The Amplified Translation says, of verse 1, and the people grumbled and deplored their hardships, which was evil in the ears of the Lord. Just general hardship. What a journey this is. It's taken forever. Cheesed off. Can't take any more. I've had enough. Grumble, grumble, grumble. The Message translation, the people fell to grumbling over their hard life. Of course, not that you and I would ever grumble about the hardships in our lives, correct? Well, we do, of course. We know we shouldn't. The scripture that says, don't become weary, particularly of well-doing, right? But we know that it's human nature to grumble. Life sometimes is just a bit more difficult than we really signed up for, right? But we know the scriptures that say the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that one day will be revealed in us. So we just have to accept some hardships are part and parcel of the journey through our wilderness to the promised land, right? Paul said it's through much tribulation that we must enter the kingdom of God. That's part of the deal. We don't get to avoid at least some tribulation, right? Paul says elsewhere that our sort of light affliction for the present time is working in us an eternal weight of glory. So what you're complaining about today might just be, in God's eyes, light affliction. What's the big problem, right? But you and I, let's face it, are prone to grumble, right? We're not necessarily very good at enduring. But we can see the problem if you don't endure and don't give a good attitude, falling into grumbling, murmuring, complaining, not seeing God in situations, being impatient. All the problems that they had, they're written down for our admonition. Let's look at Numbers 11, get to our ninth provocation. So Numbers 11, over there already, aren't we? Verses 4 through 6 to start with. Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. Mixed multitude would probably be non-Israelites, other nations, other ethnicities who had been perhaps slaves as well. So they would have left, with Israel because of Israel's escaping slavery. We were off with them. Other translations call them a rabble. Some call them riffraff, right? So they're going to work on Israel's already bad attitude and just add to it. The sort of social activists of the day, leaven among the lump, right? So they whinge and complain, and it drives the Israelites nutty, right? So the children of Israel wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat?" We remember, do you remember, Daisy? Do you remember the fish we ate freely in Egypt? The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There's nothing but this rubbish that God supplies to us, this manna, right? So highly ungrateful. And of course, they're thinking back selectively to the wonderful days as slaves being whipped and scourged in Egypt. Remember those wonderful days? But we had leeks and cucumbers, right? And turkey drumsticks. Do you remember? Wonderful, right? Of course, God's not happy with this. They're all weeping, frustration, right? Verse 10 through 15. Then Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. He's provoked yet again, because he's bringing water out of rocks. He's feeding them every day with bread from heaven. He would have given them other stuff if they'd asked, right? Moses also was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you afflicted your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you've laid the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, 'Give us meat that we may eat.' I'm not able to bear all these people alone, because the burden is too much for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now. If I found favor in your sight, do not let me see my wretchedness. I've had enough. I want to hear more. I've had enough. Kill me. If this is the way it's going to turn out, kill me here and now. Can't take any more. I've had enough." Right? So Moses is at the end of his tether. Right? God's sorely displeased by what he's seeing among this bunch of complainers. Right? But God's going to, solve the problem. Let's read verses 18 to 23. "You shall say to the people, 'Consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, Who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us back in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10, nor 20 days, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why did we ever come up out of Egypt?'" I mean, it's so insulting. If they said, "Moses, could God bring us the odd bit of turkey?" Yeah, no a problem. But no, they're weeping, they're frustrated, they're murmuring, they're grumbling, they're complaining. Now they're saying, "Why did we even never come out of Egypt in the first place? Leeks, cucumbers, Burger King. What are we doing here in the wilderness?" Right? And Moses said, "The people whom I am among are 600,000 men on food," adult men. "Yet you have said, I'll give them meat that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to provide enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to provide enough for them?" Moses is being a bit sarcastic here. The Lord said to Moses, "Has the Lord's arm been shortened? Now you shall see whether what I say will happen to you or not." Down to verse 31. "Now wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side, a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground." I think that's flying about 6 foot high or something. "And the people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers." Not quite sure what a homer is, apart from a cartoon character, but a homer apparently is equivalent to a donkey load. So if you think of a donkey and you get bags and bags of produce hanging over the donkey's back, hindquarters, It's quite a lot a donkey can carry, right? More than you can carry, right? So apparently 10 homers would be 10 donkey loads. And that's what the least had gathered. Some had 20 or 30 or 50 donkey loads worth, right? And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp, but while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. So he called the name of that place Kibroth Hattava, because there they buried the people who had yielded to craving. Kibroth Hattava means graves of lust. Now, doesn't exactly explain the problem, but one imagines complete lack of gratitude, almost guaranteed. Gluttony. I mean, if you get 10 donkey loads, that's a minimum, right? And of course, gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins. Gluttony and pride and sloth and so on, right? And of course, why would they have 10 donkey loads? At least, again, because they don't trust this God being to continue to look after them. So you need to get yours while the getting's good, right? And of course, all prompted by this riffraff, this rabble. You know, Paul says elsewhere to the Corinthians, I think, you know, bad company corrupts good manners. It's a lesson. That's the leaven that leavens the whole lump. So you need to be careful who you hang around with. For example, that's one of the lessons. If you hang around with riffraff and rabble, if you're unequally yoked, right, etc., you need to watch out, because people can influence you and can affect you, as it did there. And people died because of a combination of lack of gratitude and gluttony and all the rest of it, okay? But prompted largely by people who were riffraff, low life types. That brings us to our 10th. So let's pick up the story in Numbers again, chapter 14.
Only 5 pages.
And the story here is that they've arrived finally at the border of the Promised Land. They can wander across anytime they want, pretty much. But they send out 12 spies to spy out the land and come back with a report. And 2 come back and say, let's go. It's good. It's abundant. Look at these grapes we got here. Look at these pomegranates. Fantastic. We're off. And 10 said, terrible country. Oh, we're doomed. We're doomed. We're doomed. People that live there are like giants, and we're like little tiny grasshoppers. They'll squash us. We're doomed, right? So that was the story, the report that was brought back, verse 1 through 10 of chapter 14. So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. A lot of practice in weeping, these people. And all the children of Israel complained, murmured, a lot of practice complaining and murmuring, against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to him, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. I think I've heard that before. Or if only we had died in this wilderness. Oops. Careless comment. We'll come back to haunt them. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Now, we'd be okay because we're tough, but our poor wives and our children. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? What do you think, Solomon? Oh, absolutely, Jacob. I think that's a good idea. So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Stuff Jehovah God and his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're going back to slavery in Egypt. We've figured it out. Is this provocative or not? Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, 2 good spies, who were among those who spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. There are vineyards, orchards, beaches, there's a coast, there's lakes. It's a wonderful land. There's crops everywhere, livestock, right? Sheep. Wonderful land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them. And all the congregation said, Amen, hallelujah, let us go. That'd be a different story, of course. All the people said, stone them with stones. That'll sort them out. Right? So, I mean, what's God supposed to do? Well, he provoked another time. And this time they've gone too far. The line that was there, they've just crossed over it. They're going to go back to Egypt. That's what they're saying. We're off back to Egypt. New leader. Forget Jehovah and forget this man Moses. So God says, I'm going to destroy them all. And Moses does his usual stuff and says, please don't, because what will the Egyptians think? Blah, 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 blah. And God says, yeah, okay, fair enough. I won't destroy them. Not immediately, at least. So pick up the story, verses 17 through 35. Moses says to God, now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering, which he is, and abundant in mercy, which he is, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you've forgiven this people from Egypt, even till now. So Moses does his stuff. Please, once again, I call on you to be merciful. I know what they're like. Please be merciful. The Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. But truly, as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice. Now, some people say 10 is just a general number that means a lot. Well, maybe, but I think you can find 10 specifics, so I'll take that, literally. Have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice. They certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring him into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valley. Tomorrow turn and move out into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. Well, that's the wrong way. That's not the way into the promised land. And the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 26, and Aaron, saying, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation who complain against me? I have heard the complaints which the children of Israel make against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. We've said before, we have to watch our words. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Be careful what you say. Right? They've said, God's brought us out here to kill us in the wilderness. We're going to die in the wilderness. Well, guess what? That's what they got. They got what they said. Verse 29, the carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in this wilderness, all of you who are numbered, according to your entire number from 20 years old and above, except for Caleb and Joshua. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. But your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I'll bring them in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness. Your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and bear the brunt of your infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days. For each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years. And you shall know my rejection. So they'd rejected God endlessly. Now God says, your turn now. You've rejected me. I reject you hereby. You're finished, right? I, the Lord, have spoken this. I will surely do so to all this evil congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall be consumed, and there they shall die. Which, of course, they did. So God was provoked, he says, 10 times. And eventually it went too far. God is very patient, very merciful. We've seen that. You've experienced it. But there comes a point in time where, even for you and me, if there's some line there, best not to tempt God any further and go over it. As somebody said, you can take the people out of Egypt, but you can't take Egypt out of the people. Their minds were sort of screwed up, right? And of course, the lessons are for you and me. We've left spiritual Egypt so behind. We're on our long journey to the kingdom. It might seem longer than we expected. There might be more hardships in it than we wanted to experience. There might be obstacles and perils and risks, all right, and riffraff and rabble and all sorts. But we have to continue running that race till we get to the end of the journey, all right? And lean not on our own understanding. We've got the scriptures. These things are written down for us to learn from. Let's turn finally to Romans chapter 15 in conclusion. Romans chapter 15. So if you're now going to follow anybody, it should be Joshua and Caleb, the two sensible spies, right? Because they went into the promised land. They enjoyed it. But every other adult died in the wilderness. And that's one of the lessons to learn at this time of year. Romans chapter 15, verses 4 and 13. Verse 4, Paul writes, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning." And that would include much of the Old Testament. That would include the account of Israel's journey through the wilderness, heading for the promised land. Whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Scriptures should teach us patience and endurance as we watch others who either endured or failed to endure. And of course, the Scriptures can comfort us, encourage us, exhort us to do what is right. Let's close with verse 13. "Now may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit." So you and I, our God is a God of hope. And we still have hope for the world to come, the world tomorrow, the kingdom of God that will last for eternity. And all of these holy days are part and parcel of God's purpose and plan to lead us to that understanding. So hopefully there's some lessons there. You might want to look at one or two of them more, think about them, but they're written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come, and that for sure is right here and now. So with that, we'll conclude today's message.